don't think anybody's outside.
In Boston.
It's very good.
Yeah.
That's all they need.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're live.
We are live. We are back. And Julia is going to talk to us, starting with what we don't know at this point. And how that some of the decisions we'll have to make, some of the decisions it's being recommended we don't make until next year. And then if we have time, we'll walk through the fiscal note on this bill. Yeah, I'm gonna vote that aloud. Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay.
I brought my sleeping bag.
Thank you.
Bills are always a lot better unread.
That's true. The less we mess with things, probably the better.
That's it.
All right. Okay, it is definitely towards the end of the year. People are definitely feeling overwhelmed. And that leads to a lot of very dark. So we're gonna start, Julia, and we'll find out what we don't know. Which I think is probably a lot more extensive than this is gonna cover.
Yes, indeed.
Because this is a large bill and it has not dealt with a lot of the money issues that we need to deal with.
All right. So Julia Richard went to the office. I just sent some slides to Charlotte, post on the committee page. Let me share them on my screen.
Yeah, and everyone can see them.
So as the chair mentioned, I've been asked to come in and talk about some of the fiscal unknowns in H454. So it's a big ask because there are a lot of outstanding policy decisions. So I've tried to sort it into kind of high level fiscal unknowns. So we're nonpartisan. Nonpartisan. Who are you? I'm Julia, nonpartisan. Unbiased fiscal analysis.
If the numbers don't say
calling you
what we
nonpartisan.
want them to
I'm saying you
say.
don't want your fingerprints on this at all.
I'm saying I'm just a messenger.
She just does the addition.
Yeah. So anyways, in that vein, some caveats. High level considerations. So I'm not talking about every single fiscal unknown in the bill, but I've tried to sort them into some of the high level pieces. It's not an exhaustive list of all unknowns and considerations. I'm sure there's pieces in here that people think I should have added that I haven't added. And at the time of making this, the bill was still being contemplated in Senate, and I was supposed to do this only last week. So I was not referencing the changes, but as we're going through, I'm happy to speak to the Senate Ed pieces that are relevant. So I've separated the slide deck into sections of unknowns and how they would impact the overall fiscal landscape. You'll recall when we walked through the original fiscal note of H454 as passed by the House, there were a lot of sections that said the fiscal impact is unclear, it's dependent on policy decisions. The fiscal note for H454 is passed as recommended by Senate Ed also has a lot of that language is unclear. And one of those things is weighted student counts. So we know that weighted student counts depend on outstanding policies and demographic changes. And depending on that long-term weighted student count across districts, that will impact a number of pieces. So distribution of long-term weighted ADM across districts would depend on district boundaries. District boundaries included in the Senate Ed version still have not been determined. Shifts of students across weighting tiers would also impact weighted student counts. You know, that there's a tiered English learner weight in H 454 is passed as recommended by Senate Ed. So as students advance through English proficiency levels, the weighted student counts will change. Outstanding definitions that still need to be determined, would impact the overall count of long-term weighted ADM. H 454 passed by the House has that definition of small by necessity for small schools. And we know demographic shifts would impact the overall weighted student count. So school district configurations, this is an outstanding policy choice impacting the weighted student count. We know that the variance of weighted pupil counts across districts will depend on those district boundaries, both the actual number of students in the district, but also the number of students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, English learner students, so on. And we also know that school district boundaries themselves may impact the statewide count of long-term weighted ADM because of weighting categories. So you haven't gotten to the walkthrough of this section of the bill, but Senate Ed's foundation formula includes a small school weight. The small school weight is only for students that are in a small school, so fewer than 100 students in a sparse district.
You can raise your chair.
I actually put it down
You
because
did.
I like to have my feet on the ground.
Okay.
But thank
Why
you.
don't you get you a footstool?
It's always
Which
too
is I-
high when I sit down.
Yeah, okay.
Um,
I don't want to be playing the superior, inferior chair size game.
thank you.
Sure.
I hate people.
But the school district boundaries themselves may impact the statewide count of long-term weighted ADM, which in turn would impact the education opportunity payment, right? The more sparse districts you have, or the more sparse students you have in sparse districts, then the more weighted students in small schools, or if you do have a sparsity weight like the House.
Did the Senate do away with this sparse school, but not the sparse student?
No, the Congress. So Senate
Away with
Ed,
the sparse student,
Senate Ed does not have a weight for sparse districts.
sparse
They
district.
have a weight for students that are in small schools in sparse districts.
Do they do it as a weight, not a grant?
Correct.
In the House did.
So Senate Ed did away with both the small school support grant from the House passed version, as well as the sparsity grant from the House passed version. And then instead included a weight for students in small schools with enrollment of fewer than 100 pupil 2-year average enrollment, but only in sparse school districts, which are defined as fewer than 55 people per square land area.
But for the whole district.
Correct. So
So it could be a small school that's in an urban setting, but the rest of the district is sparse.
it would depend on the district boundaries. Yes. So that gets to this second bullet point here is if you have, say, a very large district that has fewer than 55 people on average per square land mile, then all of the schools with fewer than 100 pupils,
Right.
public schools would be eligible for that small school weight.
It should be done on a same basis, not a
I
district.
think, again, once we draw district boundaries, then we can go back, see if we've got it right. I mean, this is the present proposal. The phrase notwithstanding will probably be used with some frequency before we're finished here. This is both committees' best take. But going through all these unknowns, once any or all of them become known, might require some notwithstandings the things we do this year.
Very good question. Thank you, Madam Chair. Wasn't there also a provision in the bill that allow or has the State Board of Education define what small by necessity is versus small by choice?
Yeah, so the House passed version, I'm doing this I don't have the language in front of me, so I'm doing this out of my mind. But, the House Pass version has a small school weight. That is small by necessity, and the definition of small by necessity is, the State Board of Ed is required to submit a report defining that. My recollection is that the Senate Ed version still has that required report of what is small by necessity, but that small by necessity definition is not being tied to any of the weighting categories.
Okay.
Is it truly, given the construct for sparsity in schools, small schools that Senate Ed put together, is there a list of which small schools would qualify given our existing structures?
Yeah, we can follow up with that. I don't have it on hand.
Okay.
It will depend on the districts, right? So we can do it by current law districts, and we did do something similar and pass it out in Senate Ed.
Okay.
So we can follow up about
Okay,
that.
thank you.
Okay. So school district configurations would impact weighted student count both within the districts, whatever those districts are, as well as across the state. We know that shift of students across weighting tiers would impact the weighted student count. So H454, as passed by the House, has the tiered English learner weights and special education weights. As recommended by Senate Ed, there's no special ed weights, but there are the tiered English learner weights. So we know that as the proficiency level increases, then the weighted student count of that EL pupil will decrease, right? Because the highest weight is assigned to the lowest proficiency. So we know that would result in fluctuation over time. We at JFO still have not been able to finalize an MOU with the AOE for the suppressed EL data. So we're not able to yet provide modeling of what these tiers look like within current law districts. Another unknown, this gets back to Senator Bulick's question about small by necessity. So again, these slides I put together last week when Senate Ed was still contemplating the bill. But if the H454 House passed small school weight were to be adopted, then the cost of the small school weight or grant would depend on the definition of small by necessity, which still hasn't been defined. So those were some of the big picture questions or outstanding pieces about weighted student counts. Moving into school district boundaries. We know that school district configurations would impact fiscal analysis. This is something that we've been talking about throughout the session. This includes the weighted student count across the state within districts, which is what we just spoke about, but also the overall cost of the education opportunity payment, the amount that could be voted on for supplemental district spending, or perhaps would, depending on culture or needs within that district. The impact of the equalization mechanism for supplemental district spending, the eligibility of students to be tuitioned, and local district decisions. So we know school district configurations would impact the education opportunity payment, right? That EOP, education opportunity payment, is a long-term weighted membership of a district multiplied by the base amount. So weighted students times base. So the school district boundaries would impact both policy and funding. Because that EOP is determined by the weighted student count within the district and the base amount, the district configurations would determine this weighted student count, which in turn would impact the EOP. Impact the amount that could be voted. The H454 is passed by the House and also is recommended by Senate Ed. Senate Ed did not touch the supplemental district spending pieces. So it caps the amount that could be voted on supplemental district spending to 10% of the education opportunity payment. Right, so that means that school districts with more weighted pupils will be able to spend more in supplemental district spending than districts with fewer weighted pupils. So because that, again, school district boundaries are going to determine the amount that could be voted in supplemental district spending. Grand list value of districts is going to be determined based off of
Can I
the,
ask a question about that? Did you ever do any analysis about the 10% being not on the EOP, but on the pupil count? It seems like it's double weighting things by saying you can do 10% above the long-term weighting.
so that was a policy discussion that was had in the House side. I don't recall. I've honestly done so much analysis in
I'm
this
sure
time,
you
I
have,
don't know. But it is certainly a policy consideration, right?
Yeah.
If you're doing 10% on top of the education opportunity payment, then the districts with more weights or
Yeah.
more students, but also more weights will have
Yeah. Cause
more.
and it's almost like the students get double weighted in that they could be part of that. And so doing it based on the actual just ADM, not the weighted.
The foundation, the reason.
Yeah, more on the foundation amount. It seemed like it makes more sense to
More
me.
equitable, I thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, that conversation's been swirling around a bit.
Yeah,
That we once.
where was it from?
It's really long places. It's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be a policy choice. So different levers, of course, that you could explore.
Yeah,
And that if you are interested in doing it, the long-term membership multiplied by the base amount. Or if there was a certain amount per student that would be allowed, or a certain flat amount per district, those are all policy choices.
Mhm.
More unknowns. The equalization mechanism and the impact of it. So without knowing school district configurations, we don't know the variance of grand lists per pupil across districts, right? So if every single district had the exact same grand list per pupil, then there would be no money recaptured from using the recapture mechanism, right? The greater the variance of grand list across districts, then the greater the impact of that equalization mechanism on tax rates.
Which was the one advantage of the governor's large district proposal. If it's large enough, you have a better chance of equalizing that if you rich and poor towns.
Yes,
Then
and
transportation gets to be an issue.
and interestingly, it really depends on where those boundaries, where those lines are actually drawn.
Right.
You'll recall some months ago when we did some of those joint hearings with House Ways and Means, and I presented the analysis of grand list per pupil across different district configurations. And you saw that while the 5 districts were fewer, the VSBA regions had less variance than the governor's 5 districts. So, and I know that you were talking about that during the walkthrough as well, in terms of that variance. Another piece of that, which is more nitty gritty, but to Senator Chitnum's earlier point, is the homestead versus non-homestead. And that will depend on the equalization mechanism.
And there was variance there too.
Yeah.
Sounds like interesting.
Tuitioning, another unknown. So district configurations may impact the number of students eligible to be tuitioned. And of course, future policy choices for which students are eligible to tuition, right? The bill does make changes to tuitioning. So repeals a lot of those tuitioning calculations and in its stead, essentially equates tuition to what that student would have raised in the education opportunity payment. right? So depending on the formula, if your base amount as in the House passes 1533, I'm just saying that because I don't remember the Senate Ed base amount off the top of my head. But that 1533 would go with the student.
It's 18.
14,000, sorry, what is it?
14,870.
14,870, so in that as rec by Senate Ed, it would be the 14,870 in base amount going in tuition. If that student was, from an economically disadvantaged background, it'd be the 14,870 plus 14,870 times 1.02. That would be the new tuition payment. So school district configurations, who is eligible to be tuitioned? Unclear. And if these configurations change the number of students eligible to be tuitioned, then that would impact the flow of funds both within school districts and paid in tuition out of school districts. Local district decisions, right? This will impact the allocation of funds within districts. We also know that there will be the total spending on education will depend on local decisions as long as there's an option for supplemental district spending. So thinking about districts that experience a decrease in their spending relative to their current spending on education may decide or may not to decide to supplement that with the supplemental district spending.
Just to link that with the previous slide, Julia, it's my understanding that if a school district is a tuitioning district and they seek supplemental spending, that none of that supplemental spending goes out in tuition. Is that correct?
I believe so, but I would like Beth or John to confirm. My understanding is that tuition equals the base times the
Plus the
weight
weight.
of the corresponding
They don't
student.
get a piece of supplemental. That's my, yeah, maybe that's
My understanding, but we'll confirm that when we.
Okay.
Get John.
Another piece of the puzzle, categorical aid. So we know policy decisions about categorical aid would impact overall costs. So changes to categorical aid funding would impact overall cost of the education fund, depend on policy decisions. The bill includes intent language and or report requirements or requests regarding categorical aid and education programs. As long as current law is not changing for these categorical aid programs, we are assuming that that cost remains the same because there is no change to categorical aid, right? So we can't assume an increase in a certain categorical aid program without a change to the policy.
If we propose to change, then you could help us understand that. The one we know is that the administration, because their proposal is for the state to cover 100% of transportation costs, that's what they've figured in their payments. But that gets impacted on district and district size. If your middle school is 10 miles away and it was 2 miles away, you may, and is that right now, I guess it's on the individual schools to determine, do they do busing for sporting events? Do they have a bus that comes for a tour of the State House this time of year? We notice they're picking up. Or you depend on having parents who are willing to drive. And if the state's going to pay for it, will more schools have more transportation use if it's not on their individual budget? So there's a whole bunch just in that one area unknowns.
Yeah, and there's also the question as well of you were, I know the language does not include this, so we haven't analyzed it, but one of the questions is if you were to move to a 100% reimbursable model for transportation, is it fair to assume that costs would remain steady, right?
Yeah.
How would behavior change with a 100% reimbursable model? I think it's fair to assume there would be some behavior change, but that would really depend on the policy parameters, and until those are laid out, we can't model them. Here I pulled a few of these pieces from H454's passed by the House. Again, because I put the slides together before Senate Ed was finished. Included intent language for enacting updates to CTE governance and funding. What those updates look like will impact the fiscal estimates. Requires the AOE to submit a report regarding adult education funding if there were changes to that. Again, that would impact the fiscal estimate. Requires us, JFO, to submit a report on funding systems for pre-K and the intersection with CCFAP, public, private, etc. And lastly, we were just talking about this, requiring AOE to submit a report about transportation reimbursement. And my recollection is that the Senate Ed recommendation also includes a few other pieces as well. A few more reports for AOE. For instance, there's one about flexible pathways, expansion of less flexible pathways. School construction funding. So the H454, both as passed by the House and coming out of Senate Ed, sets up a school construction aid special fund. It includes that the fund will consist of monies transferred or appropriated coming from the supplemental district spending reserve and interest earned by the fund, but it doesn't set up a dedicated or ongoing revenue source for the special aid, the school construction aid special fund. So what that revenue source would be, again, unclear. And lastly, of course, future economic and demographic trends. So we know that inflation and the inflation index chosen would impact overall cost of the education fund. So both bills require JFO to do a report on inflation indices that could be used in Vermont's education funding formula. And there's inflation index. An inflation index, SNPA, has been applied in many places throughout the bill, including to adjust the base amount as well as homestead exemption parameters. So to the extent that inflation changes in the coming years, that will impact the costs.
Can we see at some point how NIPA has, what's it done in the increases and decreases over some amount of time, just so we get an idea?
Sure, I can follow up and send a table that has NIPA back for years that I use in my modeling.
That would help. Thank you.
And then of course, just general economic and revenue performance. I know that you have Pat in here one of these days talking about revenue performance, but the education fund does have a number of non-property revenue sources. So depending on how those non-property revenue sources perform, that will impact the amount that needs to be raised from property. Growth in the grand list. So how the grand list grows will impact both supplemental district spending and the cost of the homestead exemption. So just because the new district boundaries, or even if those new district boundaries had exactly the same grand list per pupil in that first year, it doesn't mean that they're going to always have the exact same grand list per pupil. It's fair to assume that certain parts of the state will not change uniformly. And again, coming back to the weighted student count, impacting education opportunity payments and the overall cost of the homestead exemption, right? The homestead exemption is dependent on household income, as well as housing value. And that's all I have
Okay,
here.
Oh,
I had two other.
only 20 pages of unknowns. Would you like all of these unknowns to be answered in court before?
Would I?
Yeah.
That's a question for you. I don't know if that's, I don't know how feasible that is.
Yeah.
There's a lot of really big questions
unless you
here.
think we can do the district boundaries by next Thursday. Um, I don't think all of them are getting answered. We might come up with some answers. But I think it's pretty safe to say it's going to a committee conference. And, so,
Two other unknowns, I did step out, but I looked at your slides. I don't think you spoke to them, but I don't know if this needs to be added to your slide deck, but I put it out there to see if you know if it's come up previously. Transition mechanism for districts deemed to be currently overspending. So if, you know, districts.
I think when you
And what's for Mike is also statistics, to hire somebody for a job in Chittenden County, it's 40% premium over what it is in some other counties elsewhere. So I don't know if that comes out in the weights. I don't think it does. So it just seems to me as we look at these foundation amounts, that it costs more to hire people in some parts of the state relative to others. So I don't see that adjusted.
everything I've heard, but I haven't seen any numbers, talks about raising the wages in other parts of the state so they'd be more competitive with Chittenden County. They will probably never catch up because, and that is one of the goals I think everybody has, including the administration, but
You do that, you're still raising the spending raw,
Yeah.
and then you still got a
and
problem.
I haven't seen any proposals on how we're gonna do that. The question remains, and I know the administration is looking at that per pupil spending, overall spending line. And until we answer quite a few of these unknowns, we won't know that. Once we know the districts, we can eliminate quite a few of those, but I haven't heard anyone talk about how we're gonna raise teacher salaries, except somebody said to me, if you have fewer people, meaning mostly paras in the schools, then you will have fewer people you're providing health insurance for, you'll have some savings. But I have yet to see how that's gonna work out, and that is not
Just-
part of our,
Just to elaborate my point though, if you had to take two schools, one in Chittenden County, one in Essex County, the same kids, hiring the same staff to support those populations, it's gonna be possibly 40% more expensive to hire those same people in Chittenden County.
yes,
In Essex County, I just don't see that at all considered in the current discussion.
I don't think anyone's talking about lowering the wages in Chittenden County. I would tell them to relax.
I think,
Trying to raise them.
I think in some ways it's, you know, this bill removes sparsity, which is, you know, it's more expensive to, when you're spread out to operate.
Yeah.
And that's their pressure, your pressure, it's labor, if you take both of them away, at least kind of balances it out a little bit.
Your housing's more expensive. I don't know the groceries are. They may be more expensive in a sparser area because you just have less volume.
With the labor is what I'm focusing.
Yeah, but I mean, the labor is based on, your labor market, which is the way on your costs.
80%.
But no one's talking about lowering that. They're talking about raising everybody else up. So you may have to compete more, but some of the other districts are getting tired of training teachers that then go to other counties.
I've always thought that. A floor would be a good idea.
Yeah.
Cause that doesn't, you know, just doesn't
Makes
necessarily
that-
pull everybody up here. but
Yeah.
At least gets them there.
Get them up. And we have
I don't know.
significant help for some in
Yeah.
their health insurance.
Yeah.
It's costly. They are getting a lot better. Some of them are getting a lot better insurance than this. Senator Hardy,
No, that's okay.
okay. Any other questions for Julia? Okay. Now we know what we don't know. Shall we go through you have the outlook?
I do have the fiscal note or board reports recommended by Senate Ed if you would like.
Yes.
Yes, can we get a printed copy of that?
The
This fiscal note?
Sure.
The Senate Ed version?
Yeah.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Thanks, guys. Yes, to make points.
I assume there's a fiscal note for the House version too.
Yes, and I actually walked through that, the House passed some weeks days ago. Weeks ago,
It
I'm
all
not sure.
runs together when you're having fun. Yes, we do. And that will be on our website once we figure out what day it is.
Yes, and I did send this to Charlotte, right when I came in here, actually.
Is anyone else having a hard time getting on the Senate? For that one? No,
And it tries this
website.
on the committee page, it's working up here from the.
Yeah, it's just me then. Sorry to interrupt, Julia.
Oh, I've had issues in the past here. Keep going.
Okay, so we've tried to keep it as consistent or similar as the H 454 fiscal note. And of course, there's different section numbers. So again, this is the same as what we talked about when I walked through the H 454 House passed. And what we just spoke about, because so much of this rests on future policy decisions, the overall fiscal impact of the bill is unclear and will remain unclear until all of those policy decisions have been made. It's fair to assume many of the provisions will have fiscal impacts in future years. There are some fiscal impacts of the bill in FY26 that we've included in this table here. So section 3 establishes the school district boundary task force. So there would be per diems for the 8 members and an appropriation to hire one or more consultants. There is a 100,000 appropriation from the general fund to Ledge Council for the consultants, and the 33,000 would be from monies appropriated to the legislative budget. This is sections 15 and 16 is appropriation to facilitate revision of the board's rules. This is consistent with the House passed. The state aid for school construction program includes 3 AOE positions to staff the program and requires AOE to come back to the General Assembly and with position descriptions and more details. So these costs would be an ongoing appropriation because there would be new positions. But because they haven't been established, the positions nor appropriations are made in the bill. So JFO right now is estimating that would be about $450,000. But that would depend on, of course, housing decisions. The School Construction Advisory Board, cost to AOE, no appropriation, about 3,000 estimated for per diem. And then lastly, a specialized strategic plan appropriation for 1 new permanent position at AOE for the strategic plan development. You'll note that there are a few parts of this table, the miscellaneous tax pieces, that were included in the House passed version and are not included in here. They're also not included in the fiscal note, and that's because the bill is coming out of recommended by Senate Ed. Kirby sections were just not included, so those would need to be added back in this bill. They didn't take any of those up.
Okay,
That's
Or
awesome.
they're just not in the bill at all?
Correct.
Oh, I wondered why it was so much shorter.
so this would be the miscellaneous tax and miscellaneous,
Yeah, and this would be a question for John and Kirby, but my understanding is just all of Kirby's sections. So those miscellaneous tax pieces, the RAD pieces, the
Okay, Kirby told me what he had in here was the reappraisal.
reappraisal, miscellaneous tax,
Separation of the categories or.
classification of
Yeah.
properties. So just flagging that because those are not included in the language coming out of Senate Ed. They're not included in the fiscal note. There are some pieces in that are miscellaneous tax.
And that they could put it on there. She is looking at that to help pay for some mental health support in the schools. That would just, I think, be more focused and more likely to make it through this year. We'll look at it. We haven't raised the tobacco tax in a number of years. It was almost an annual event for a while. And then we went to vapes. I know vapes were something like 92% of wholesale. We're pretty high. I don't think we're that high on tobacco products, but we will look at that. So there is a miscellaneous ed bill out there, which may not have anything that affects spending in it, but if they put the tax in there, it comes up. So I found that out at 1:00. So we will see what heads our way. But that would, if we could raise some outside funding, it would help some of the costs. Okay.
So then going into the sections of the bill, section 3, this is the school district boundary task force. So this would be 8 legislative members, 4 Senate, 4 House, not all the same party. Charged with making not more than 2, more than 0 maps for consideration, and also what to do if the General Assembly did not approve enact new boundaries before January 31st of 2026. Up to 16 meetings. Again, this is that appropriation for of 100,000 for consultants.
It's like meeting every week.
That's a lot of meetings.
A lot of work. A lot of work. The work we've already done it this year.
It was 12 coming out of the house, right?
I don't remember. I'm sorry, I would need to look.
Yeah, I know. That could be wrong. I thought it was 12 coming out of the house.
It was also not a legislative task force coming out of that.
That's right.
It was a subcommittee of the commission.
People with actual expertise.
Yeah, but the
People who know what they're talking
commission
about.
has a limited budget too. It was appropriated 130,000, or there was money that got sent to AOE to do something. It was still sitting there.
School construction, it was originally for the school construction working group,
Working
200,000, and then it was expanded for the commission. I checked in with AOE sometime in either March or April, and there was around, I think, 50,000
Still
left of that appropriation.
So they've been.
Unobligated?
More than half. For the commission, they have hired a consultant for civic engagement, how to do that. So I'm not sure if that 50,000 reflects that commitment or not. AOE is handling all those arrangements. So, and they are doing the staffing for the commission.
Yeah, so this is a change in staffing as well, because the House passed was commission, so it's primarily being staffed by the administration, and this is a legislative task force, so it's being staffed primarily by legislative staff. Sections 4 through 12, this is the state aid for school construction, no major changes from what came over from the House, and also consistent with the work of the school construction aid task force over the summer.
But all of this is hinges on the districts, what we end up doing with the districts.
Yeah, that gets back to that,
Yeah,
the unknowns.
right.
There's so many unknowns here. This creates the special fund, the school construction needs special fund, but it's unclear beyond, funds from the supplemental district spending reserve, which would depend on school district boundaries and also district choices. It would be funded by amounts transferred by the General Assembly. Unless there were other policies.
Property wealthy towns. We're going to feel happy with having their taxes go into a fund to build schools in, or repair schools in other towns when they can't pass a bond to repair them in their own. So that's a proposal. I don't.
That already happens.
Yeah.
We help fund, everybody helps fund the
Yes,
funds
it
that
does
do
for the,
pass.
for the ed, but I think we heard, other than the 3 in Chittenden County, no other schools, there's no outstanding 30-year bonds. is
I
what
think there's
thought.
one in Windsor County.
Is there one?
That's what I just heard this morning, Tommy.
Okay, maybe,
But I could be wrong about that, but
I heard they were proposing a bond for Fine Arts Center that got
Oh,
my
maybe.
attention.
maybe that was the proposal, not.
But basically, schools have not been bonding, have not been able to pass bonds to fix their leaky roofs, which seems to be epidemic in this state. And, so that's something we're gonna have to talk about.
Same with the appropriations for the worker, the AOE employees to do the state construction aid. That wouldn't kick in until all of this is settled, right? In terms of the districts and the.
Yeah, so there is no appropriation for the positions. So what we've got here, AOE has indicated that administering the program would likely require 3 full-time positions. Estimating that would cost the general fund amount. AOE is required to submit a report to you all about the recommended position descriptions and job titles.
Okay. So what was that? 150.
These aren't the,
That was the estimated cost. Thank you.
Okay.
okay,
But
these
no
aren't the
appropriation.
same positions. There was something like, what, 3 or 4 million in the budget request. And, but that was for 3 or 4 plus consultants, maybe for the transitions and just staffing over
Yeah,
there.
so the big bill has, the big bill, of course, it's still being determined in conference, but has the 4 million being booked for the AOE transformation. And my understanding is that there's language there, essentially requiring the AOE to come with specific outline in terms of what that money will be spent on for it to be, approved by DFC. I think that there's still some, people are still looking for more detail regarding the 4 million.
It's a little vague when I heard it, but I'm not. Okay. Yeah, it's a lot of money. I mean, we're doing 3 to 4 positions for 450,000, not 3 to 4 million. So. There's something else being anticipated.
And I think that the budget conferees are still considering, if that's 4 million all at once or over a certain number of years or, yeah, the nuances, but,
It's not a done deal at this point.
but that, and that's included in the budget, that's not included in this bill.
Right.
13 and 14, these sections, add qualifiers to permitted payments to tuition. So essentially providing more limitations about where into which schools tuition may be paid. So adding these guidelines about enrollment, so at least 25% of Vermont resident student enrollment, as well as physical location within 25 miles. And the others, but I'm not gonna read it all unless that would be helpful.
You know what the rash of emails we're getting on restore the 51% rule is?
That's on the number of percentage of publicly funded students in a private school.
School.
Both the governor and the House had it at 51% and the House and Senate education.
So we
Not
will,
down to
we're gonna
25.
ask Chair of Education to come down and share their thought process with us on the number of these, why.
He'll be here tomorrow at
He'll be
4.
here tomorrow at 4, okay. Okay, and if you don't finish by 5:30 tomorrow, I have a town hall Zoom. So I'll have to take my iPad to the empty room at 5:30. I'm hoping we're out for chairs at 4:30 today, but we're gonna do this, and if I don't make chairs, I don't make chairs, so let's keep going.
All right, keep moving. Heard. Next up, we've got the State Board of Education rules, initiate rulemaking to comply with the statutory requirements for approved independent schools. And this is also where there's that report to propose standards for a school deemed small by necessity. But that would no longer, that term is no longer being used for waiting. Section 16, this requires reports from the State Board of Education and appropriates $200,000 from the general fund to AOE in FY26 to provide with resources to review the rules. Section 17, I was mentioning this during that unknowns slide deck, but a number of reports and recommendations are required from AOE, including graduation requirements, proposed implementation plan for data and information systems. This is where there's the required report for recommendations for school construction division within AOE, guidance needed to facilitate mergers, analysis of education payment, allocation within districts, and if necessary, recommended changes. And we referenced this earlier, report with recommendations for increasing flexible pathways opportunities. 18 through 20, this is the development of a special education strategic plan. Staying high level because I know you've got a lot going on, but happy to dig into any of the details if that's helpful.
Was this also in the House version?
Some iteration of this, yes. I don't know if there were changes.
Okay.
I would need a phone,
That's okay.
my good friend Beth. Sections 21 and 22. This is where there's that calculation of tuition that we were talking about, so that tuition would now be based multiplied by the weighted pupil count of the students attending school. So all of those sections, unless I noted them otherwise, we really can't estimate the fiscal impact because of all of those unclears and unknowns that we spent the first hour talking about.
What this is coming down to.
No attitude.
No.
Because
But
honestly, I was
Right
tired.
now we're talking about, the big question, is this going to save money? It's,
Are you, is that a statement or a question?
no, I think that is, it's that cost per student that the administration wants. They have a number, 13, and this one's at 14 something, but there's so many unknowns that we don't know, and we can't know. Is it going to save or cost money?
The growth is controlled by inflation index.
Yeah. I mean, we will get more control over it, and if we can bring some kind of sanity to our administrative structure, that might give us more control and save some dollars. And it will depend on how we organize the districts. And nobody has dealt, I don't think, maybe it's in John's section, but I don't think so, about voting within districts and are there local school districts and board
The
districts?
House version has a ward task force. The Senate
To look at.
version just says, oh, that committee will make a recommendation.
So,
For fear of weakening the Senate's position as we go into a committee conference with the House, I will say to your point, Madam Chair, and I already said this in the hallways, and I'll say it on YouTube now, that the class size minimum seems like something we should address, because that's something I can say to my voters with a straight face, that having our school boards strive for certain sizes of scale. Everything I understand about how you run a school will achieve some savings. So I'm not saying that I want to add it back to Senate Finance. We need to stay in our lane. I saw merit in what the House did on having class size minimums to strive for. So I'm really looking forward to Senator Bongart's making the case for why the committee felt like they needed to drop that. Because it seems like good policy. Now, how you enforce it, that's another question. I don't want it to be a heavy iron fist of government coming in and shutting schools down if they don't get those. But I do think it's useful for school boards out there to be able to say, the state's telling us we need this many kids, so this is what we got to do. So that's a big open question for me.
yes, so we will ask him. That goes on the questions tomorrow. I know it was what drove a lot of no votes. In the other body, I was told it's like dividing up the grand list concerns a lot of people until you know what the school districts are going to look like. And we might make sure that that goes in the instructions for the committee that's working this summer, is that having that minimum, that a district that would facilitate, because we've talked about regional high schools, smaller but bigger than elementary schools, and then small local elementary schools. You're not going to get 4,000 kids in a school, in a small elementary school in Vermont. So where do we get? Where do those numbers come in? How do we step them up? We go into how you configure your districts. And I don't know who we might hire as a consultant, but I know part of the issue has been the House started with a cost base, what we're spending now, and that's what Tammy Colby is based on. This is what it costs. This is what it costs to do special ed. The administration's proposal is based on the best practices. What is it called? Evidence-based formula. So if you look nationally, maybe internationally, this is what all the evidence indicates is the size at which you get the most economical provision of the best education. We are much smaller in some ways, but also, I mean, we are a small state with a small population, but we are also closer together in our small towns than Wyoming or any of the Dakotas. And so the question is, how do we transition from here to here, and how do we adjust that evidence base to a Vermont size? And what are the cost implications of all of it? And we are not going to have definitive answers when we go home, may it be before July 4th. And we are not probably gonna have definitive answers before this session ends. We will have better, as we make decisions, we can do better projections, but you know, maybe we'll be annexed by Canada before that. That would solve all our problems. There's just a lot of unknowns out there in every aspect of what we're doing in this program this year. So test our tolerance.
When I say something quick, I know we want Julia to be able to finish, but I do think Senator Chinnick brings up a really good point, which is, I mean, what is our North Star in the work that we're doing? Is it just to cut costs? And if so, you know, what are we willing to do to get there? And because class size would be an obvious choice, right? So I think it'd be nice for our committee at some point to talk about what is our strategic plan.
I think both the House and the Senate have laid out similar things. I've heard the administration, they want to get a system that the average person in Vermont can afford. In doing that, they intend to provide better educational opportunities for kids. Everybody should have access to and equity,
Yeah.
you know, computer programming and robotics and fine arts and music. And they want to, maybe not in all counties, but get more equity in teachers' salaries. But I've heard 100 times from the administration, it's to get a better education, and the evidence for this thing says we can do.
Okay.
We'll figure that out as we go.
Because I mean, equity is about bringing everyone up to a level using
Yeah.
resources that will allow them to achieve.
Right.
Right, so we have to,
I mean, if we
That's
just
fine.
wanted to save money, we would just do a foundation formula, put it at a rate that we think everybody can afford and say, that's it. If you can't afford math in fourth grade, too bad.
right,
We're not doing that. We're
right. We
trying
would
to,
also get sued immediately for
Yes,
that.
we would.
Yeah.
well, maybe not. I
They'll
mean,
lose the next election and they just do it.
Someone else.
so we're trying to find that middle path for that scarlet bright path, to a really good education. I'm very concerned at, at the number of students that do not go on for any kind of training after high school.
Right.
I'm concerned about students that are eligible for a green and gold scholarship and have to find ways to take classes that their school doesn't offer. That it's just the number of math, the
Right.
number of science classes. They need to get into this university. And I think we did it with the state colleges, and I think up until now, we've done it with schools, which is just say, spend less. And we haven't succeeded. And I think we've reached the point where the schools are making cuts that none of us are comfortable with, that really impact education, at least a fair number of schools. And so that's what we're trying to fix.
Well, I'm also concerned as I look at education spending, that the number of schools that spend relatively less, sometimes as much as half as much as other schools, and appear to have better performance, better statistics. And I still haven't heard good explanations as to why.
I have asked several times. I know that AOE has one of these graphs and they've got different colored circles, and these are high spending, high performing, low spending, high performing. I have asked them to come in on that, and we will try again, because I would like to know, and I know when Pikus was actually here a number of years ago, that's what he did. What
Mhm.
do these schools do? What should we be helping other schools?
I mean, I've heard anecdotal evidence. I've asked people from the communities involved, why are you getting such good results compared to your neighbors and people in the farthest reaches away from you in Vermont?
Yeah.
And I've heard some things, but they're all very, very anecdotal and they're very soft.
So we will try again. And see if we can get them to come over and talk to us.
Now, why are there certain variations, for example, in terms of, things that go on within schools? Say the number of people, number of kids, for example, who are in special ed, the number of kids who are in intensive programs in some schools, and in the town next door, they're not. And again, when you start looking at the results aren't any different. Why?
Practice,
It is a good question.
practice the school values.
It may well be the quality of personnel.
I've heard that.
Leadership within the
I've
school.
heard that too.
I have been told that we don't have the accountability that others do. And it isn't really within our jurisdiction, but it does result in spending. So I think we are within our realm to ask that question. What do these high performing, low spending schools do that we could emulate? Or aim to emulate in other schools? Okay. Julia, we'll let you finish.
Sure.
We're getting into committee discussion.
All right, so we just walked through all of the policy pieces. Now we're getting into the sections, 23 through 42, which are establishing the new finance formula.
And this is the ones we didn't go over today because they are John's
Correct.
drafting.
So, sections 23 and 24, these sections repeal the current law weights and include new or amended pupil weights as well as the base amount per pupil. So this is the Senate Ed recommended, pass out of Senate Ed. These are the weights that were included in the bill, which correspond with a base amount of 14,870 per pupil. So these weights are still additive, meaning that a student may fit into more than one of these categories, in which case all of those weights would be added together for that student. So for instance, if you had a student that was in grade 9, they would receive an additional 0.1 weight. If that student was level 1 in English language proficiency, they would receive an additional 2.11 weight, right? So 0.1 plus 2.11. They were also from an economically disadvantaged background. They would also receive a 1.02. And the small school weight, this is what we spoke about, students attending a small school with an average enrollment of two-year average enrollment of less than 100 pupils in a district with fewer than 55 people per square mile. Okay.
Thank you, Jim.
If I may make a big picture comment, my concern with the trajectory we're going in, which it's a problem with the current system, but it's inspired from an email Senator Kulik sent out last week with her analysis by the UVM students. My biggest concern with the direction we're going with this foundation amount is we are not dictating that these foundation blocks are spent on only certain activities. I understand from that write-up you sent out, other states do. They say the foundation amount can be spent on math, English, this. And I just wonder, I know we're late, we're far down the path on this. Maybe when we come back next year, if that might get to it. I just thought to make that comment because I still come back to why we're using weights versus categorical aid with English language learners from that previous conversation. I'm questioning it here. This is undirected dollars just going to the schools and they'll spend it on whatever they want. But I'm just saying other states have these foundation blocks where they say it can only be spent on these things and then additional spending is what they would put to the voters. Just a general comment.
But they, right now, if they can use, because we're doing taxing capacity, they can use that extra capacity to hold down their tax rate and never provide any service.
I'm not defending her.
This will be cash and we can ask for how it was spent. It's a lot more easily measured.
That concern is applicable to current state and future state. That we're talking
Oh, no, I'm sorry, I didn't.
No, I think my hand holding is not, I should be a little more aggressive with my hand holding.
No,
Yeah,
you're just in my blind.
All I would say is that if we're gonna contemplate changing from weights to categorical grants, I think we should have people in to testify, because I know folks who work, especially with the EL population, who will say that they know the needs of their population and they want to be able to direct money appropriately to the kids and the needs that they have, which might be hard to quantify in a, with a categorical grant. So that I would just want to hear from folks. That's all I would say.
Well, I guess the one question also that comes to mind in all of this is that of accountability. If you're the manager of an industrial plant and you're making a product, if 26% of your product is defective, in other words, it doesn't do what it's supposed to do based on what you put into it, you start firing managers. Do you do that in education? If you have leaders of schools or districts who aren't delivering the results that you said they should be delivered for what the investment is, do we do anything?
We don't control that.
We don't control that at all, but what we do is, I think, perhaps is measure if there is an effective accountability process that is making a difference in the education in that school or in that district. And that we do have the ability to do something.
And that can maybe, let's think about what we could put in that would increase accountability.
Or at least an explanation why there is an accountability.
Yeah.
If there's a reason that makes sense, again, whoever is evaluating it doesn't just act on the basis of the number.
Mhm. Yeah.
But I haven't heard the word accountability used at all in any of this.
Well, we will put it in
Sure.
where the numbers committee. So we should want to know, want it tracked.
Then I want report cards for parents also.
Oh, well, after listening, doing some of these, listening boards with the
Certainly is a
commission,
factor.
I've started to wonder if we shouldn't be investing more money in parenting education. When you hear some of the stories about who's walking into the school, it has changed drastically in the last 15, 20 years. So, and I would like, we're putting all this money into pre-K. I would like to know when those kids that go to pre-K come into first grade, are they
People just keep talking and
more ready to learn? Okay, I haven't seen your hand up.
I've been having my.
Sorry, I was talking her.
Martine went in front of me and then ran.
No, my time's up before you.
Okay, whatever.
It's your record.
I just want to say, I just want to respond to something that Senator Shannon said, and I think that, it sounds like, what you're proposing is sort of a weights, but with the accountability of a categorical aid. And yeah, and I guess a couple things I would say to that is one, I think we have to be careful about tying the hands of school districts too much. So, to Senator Gulick's point about the EL weights, and that was a whole thing a couple of years ago that you might remember a little bit of. But I also think that, we have education quality standards, and that in fact, the House version of the bill would have updated those education quality standards, and our Senate Education Committee took that out. So they took out some of the sort of accountability measures that were supposed to be strengthened, that the House wanted to see strengthened. And I think that you know, if we want to make sure that these new weights sort of match those education quality standards, that's essentially what the House was trying to do. It's like, let's update these quality standards to meet how we're updating our funding formula. We could consider putting something like that back into the bill and tying it a little bit more, saying, you know, in order to get these things, you have to report on these. But there is a whole process for AOE holding school districts accountable to those standards. And it's, as I've said on this committee before, it's rarely enacted anymore. It has been in the past. I know for sure because I was on a school board when one of the schools in my district was held accountable and there was a whole plan they had to go through and everything. It's just the AOE hasn't done that for a number of years. And so I think there are multiple sections of the bill that we could consider putting back in that would get some of the course and maybe modifying them a little bit to be more directly tied if that seems to feel so just to consider that.
For tomorrow, the act. Vanguards about what they were thinking and why they took that out. I'm gonna let Julia finish since my next meeting just walked through the door. But the committee can go home.
So you want me to keep going?
Yes,
Okay,
we have other bills, believe it or not.
All right. So these are the weights and weighting categories as recommended by the Senate Ed Committee. We've got a technical amendment here too. 25 is section 26. This is new. This gets at Senator Chittenden's earlier question about the transition. So the Senate Education Committee included a transition mechanism to phase in the educational opportunity payments from FY28 through FY2030. So the Senate Ed version does bump up where the foundation formula would start. So it'd be in effect July 1, 2027, which is the start of fiscal year 2028. So essentially the way that the transition mechanism would work is for each fiscal year of the transition gap would be calculated, and that would be done by subtracting the district's EOP from the school district's education spending. In the ed spending in FY25 adjusted for inflation to that year. And so that would be the transition gap. It could be positive or negative.
Is it on a per pupil basis or a gross aggregate?
That could be positive or negative, right? Depending if the educational opportunity payment is greater or less than the education spending adjusted for inflation. And then that transition gap, depending on the year, would be multiplied by a factor, 0.75 in the first year, 0.5, and then 0.25, and added to the district's educational opportunity payment. So essentially what it would be doing is if the EOP would be greater than the education spending, it would be stepping up by a quarter, essentially, each year, or a third each year up. If the EOP would be less than the education spending, it would be a step down.
Based on the fixed value of 2028.
No, based on the education spending in FY25 adjusted for inflation, and then the educational opportunity payment in the fiscal year that is being enacted. Okay. And that will cost so much.
Well, no, but not because it's gonna soften the benefit too.
So,
So,
yeah. The preliminary modeling is not a huge cost, but we can come in with more hard numbers when we have a chance to do that. Because you've got districts that are
On rent, off rent.
gaining and districts that are gaining more dollars, districts that are losing some dollars. And you'll recall that the Senate Education base amount was calculated with the weights so that the overall education payment would equal the total education spending in FY25. So the educational opportunity payment across the state under the Senate Ed construct would be about 1.88 billion, which is consistent with FY25 education spending. So it may not be completely neutral, but it wouldn't be as expensive as other transition.
And then everything else in here, is unchanged. This was the last section that Senate Education worked on. In H454 is passed by the House. There are still these sections of the bill which are consistent with, what we walked through in H454 is passed by the House. And then the recollection that, after section 42, those other pieces like definition of the property tax classifications, the regional assessment districts and rate appraisals, the miscellaneous tax pieces, those pieces were not included in the bill, but that was more from a process standpoint rather than a policy decision.
So we have the homestead income sensitivity sections have not been dealt with by the Senate.
Correct.
And the above base spending was not dealt with.
Correct.
And any kind of property tax classification division has not been dealt with. Correct. We will
Increases.
look at the base funding, we will look at the weights and those questions, because they have financial implications, but we have those other two that are out there, that we will look at and have to make some decisions on. And then we will know where we're going. Okay. Questions for Julia? Okay. All right. I'm gonna, yeah. This is gonna have to gel pretty fast to get us out of here. I'm gonna have us focus on the areas that are our jurisdiction. And then we can talk about other areas. Okay?
When do we vote this out?
A week of Thursday is what I have been asked to aim for. I have made no guarantees,
Thursday night's gonna be.
but this will keep us from being here. I think we're gonna be here through Memorial Day. Because these things are all gonna have to go to Congress. Now you can't forget. Okay, I think that's it.